title of this lecture is We, the Non-Europeans. This is partly inspired by Etienne Balibar's We, the People of Europe. And also, I will come around to address the issues of this distinction between a question mark. We have already begun the discussion. We, the people of Europe. In my title, by the way, there's no question mark. I am definitely speaking from the ambiguous position of we, the non-Europeans. But this is also reading Said with Derrida and reading Derrida with Said in the context of the crisis of Europe. But the beginning point of understanding of the crisis of Europe, as soon as we use that phrase, of course, the crisis is associated with the financial, economic crisis, the austerity, European Union, and associated crises that we have experienced over the last 5 years. But here, the crisis, I understand it to be Europe as crisis. And so the crisis of Europe, understanding what kind of crisis Europe is. And this is the problem, I think, rehearses both Derrida's and Said's minds. If indeed then the crisis of Europe is more fundamental than the current crisis that engulfs it, then how do we diagnose that fundamental crisis? How do we approach Europe as crisis? How do we address the question, what is called Europe? The question is made even more challenging when we further ask what the referent Europe refers to, and what are the forces that use that referent. When Derrida was delivering a lecture on the other heading on 20th of May in 1990 in Turin, during a colloquium on European cultural identity, he was in many ways responding to these questions and outlining possible ways of approaching them. But Derrida's problem of Europe, to me, is much older than that. Europe had been, in a way, a problem for Derrida, at least philosophically, from the moment he encountered Husserl and engaged a cluster of problems that Husserl had articulated as the crisis of Europe, a cluster which gave also rise to various thoughts on Europe by Heidegger, Sartre, and Levinas. So there is a danger in beginning with the other heading in 1990 and forgetting that Derrida's ethical and political problem of Europe had exercised him practically all his public life. There are other scholars, especially Rodolphe Gachet, who consider the problem of Europe as Derrida's problem. What I wish to address in this lecture is how Derrida's problem of Europe can be brought into sharper relief with Edward Said's problem of Orientalism. Said too was exercised by the question of Europe, or what is called Europe, albeit from a very different angle. Said's Europe was one which articulated itself through what Derrida would later call its wholly other. It's true that Derrida and Said rarely, if at all, are brought or read together. There are good reasons for this. Said himself reacted strongly to what he considered a crippling limitation in those varieties of deconstructive Derridian readings that end, as they began, in undecidability and uncertainty. For Said, the readings that Derrida provides defer too long a declaration that the actuality of reading is fundamentally an act, perhaps modest human emancipation and enlightenment that changes and enhances one's knowledge for purposes other than reductiveness, cynicism, or fruitless standing aside. How Said came to associate those attitudes with Derrida and to assume that Derrida would not recognize the demand that we as citizens, quote, enter into the text, this is Said, enter into the text with responsibility and scrupulous care, remains a problem for me. Its beginnings can be traced to an early essay where Said considered Derrida and Foucault as having opposed positions on reading. Martsek and Radhakrishnan discuss Said's vexed relations to Derrida and Foucault, respectively. These issues, however, are not my concern here and today. I am not interested in consigning Derrida and Said to their posts, whether it's post-colonialism or post-structuralism. Rather, I'm concerned with making Derrida and Said speak against and with each other on the question of the non-European, a contrapuntal encounter, if you like. In a nutshell, for both Derrida and Said, the fundamental crisis of Europe, Europe as crisis, is an inability to approach to non-European with an openness that it requires. To put it differently, the question is not quite even what is called Europe, one of the questions that I opened with, but what is called non-European? Or, even more subtly, what does Europe call as non-European? This question is simultaneously an ethical, political, psychoanalytical, and philosophical question, each irreducible to the other, and yet each complicating the other. Let me start with Said's reflections on Freud and the non-European, then discuss the problem of the non-European in Derrida, and draw these readings together with Balibar to conclude the lecture. Said begins with the observation that Freud's knowledge of other cultures was deeply inflected by his education in Judeo-Christian tradition, especially European humanism and scientism. Said says that Freud was not bothered much by the problem of the other. This may appear as a strange statement, since Freud is arguably the classic figure in the invention of the other. Yet the other that preoccupies Freud, Said suggests, is a European other, specifically European. According to Said, quote, Freud was deeply gripped by what stands outside the limits of reason, convention, and of course consciousness. His whole work in that sense is about the other, but always about an other recognizable mainly to readers who are well acquainted with the classics of Greco-Roman and Hebrew antiquity and European languages. Yet, in both Totem and Taboo and Moses and Monotheism, Said detects an implicit refusal by Freud to establish an insurmountable difference or gap between the European and the non-European as a beginning point. It's this refusal, though implicit, that can be said to constitute Freud's ethics towards the non-European. Politically, Freud goes even deeper, Said thinks, and claims that the very fabric of the European is in fact made up of non-European elements. Said notes, for example, that Freud was adamant about Moses' identity. Quote, Moses was an Egyptian and was therefore different from the people who adopted him as their leader. People, that is, who became the Jews whom Moses seems to have later created as his people. What Said observes is not so much, I think, the historical accuracy of Freud's interpretation. In fact, there is enough evidence in Said's writing that he remains unconvinced and unsatisfied for its veridicality. But its audacity, given how aware Freud was of the dangers of his interpretation and how uncertain Freud himself was about it, and that uncertainty or uncertain space that Said wanted to explore. And what Said highlighted, and this is of utmost importance when we discuss especially Derrida's articulation of the question of non-Europeans, is that, quote, in excavating the archaeology of Jewish identity, Freud insisted that it did not begin with itself, but rather with other identities, Egyptian, Arabian, which his demonstration in Moses and Monotheism goes a great distance to discover and thus restore to scrutiny. Freud's audacity was then to have argued that the founder of Jewish identity was himself a non-European Egyptian, And Said concludes from this that identity cannot be thought or worked through itself alone. It cannot constitute or imagine itself without that radical originary break or flaw which will not be repressed because Moses was Egyptian, end of quote. It's this political stance that Derrida considers also as the problem of the non-European. For both Said and, as I shall now discuss, Derrida, the European is always already the non-European. This is not a thesis of identity or even identification. It's not a claim that European is equivalent to non-European, or that there is no difference between the European and the non-European. It is a thesis of impurity. It is the assertion of an impossibility of any social group constituted, however, as a people, a nation, or a profession, being able to identify itself with itself without any relation or reference to the other. It is an impossibility thesis. As I said earlier, Gachet closely examines how Derrida approaches Europe along these lines. I will briefly discuss him, and then I'll come back to both the relationship between Derrida and Said. Gachet illustrates how Derrida inherits a tradition in which Europe never figures as a geographic, always already constituted or political entity, but it's always something other, which has been called by various names. It is that tradition that Derrida shifts our attention to. Husserl, for example, calls Europe an idea or a concept. Gachet makes reference to other names, such as Europe as a figure, an image, Valéry, a category, Badiou, a schema, Gonon, and a little thing, Derrida. Derrida often playfully talks about Europe as being a little thing, as a question. He could have also included a vanishing mediator, Balibar. I will come back to that. If Europe is not merely an entity, what are its origins then as an idea? As Gachet says, although Europe as a name originates perhaps in the 7th century BC, it's uncertain, it is doubtful that it meant the same thing in subsequent centuries. Arguably, Greeks themselves inherited this name from Asia, where its possible meaning, dusk, designated the land of evening, or perhaps even darkness. Intriguingly, Gachet suggests the Greeks may well have not thought of themselves as Europeans, but those who were glancing toward dusk, or perhaps darkness, looking toward the land of evening. Thus, in later centuries, by naming itself as Europe, Europe arguably constitutes itself with a name that originates, again, outside itself. Its beginning point cannot be itself. In a very strong sense, and following Derrida, Gachet says that this is perhaps then, if there is to be a character of Europe, is character of Europe. It calls itself by the name of the other. Europe comes to name itself, is able to name itself only through the other, or the name inherited from the other. It comes to itself from outside of itself. He says, what the name of Europe perhaps then refers to is not primarily to proper name of a land, but a name for a movement of separation and tearing oneself away, in which everything proper has always already been left behind. It is thus an extension prior to all confinement within oneself, thus constituting an exposure to the foreign, the strange, and the indeterminate, or perhaps the determination to stay open to other than itself. Europe, then, is not a proper name, and the name comes to Europe from outside. The name Europe designates an obscure part of the world where the sun sets, or perhaps where darkness resides. The name itself names Europe's origin in a movement of departure from everything native. Europe is non-native. Europe always glances toward the distance, being always ahead of itself, with the other. Europe is, perhaps can be, or rather stands for, a fundamental openness to the world. Quote, to elicit the name of Europe is not only to evoke the continent, its history, its autochthony, but Europe as a geographical and political entity, as well as the history of its accomplishments and its failures. Beyond all this, something else as well, even though one does not know exactly what that is at the moment of evoking the name itself. It remains to come. It remains to be named. It remains to be determined. Articulating Europe as a concept, then, takes its name from outside. Gachet also provides a strong sense of the kind of project Europe is. This sense is clearly indebted to Derrida, as Gachet readily admits, but it also locates Derrida within a project, or rather, as belonging to a project, or better still, as inheriting a task. That is Europe. In this sense, Europe is a task that calls us. Derrida himself intimates this with his emphasis on the relationship between inheritance and responsibility, or rather, and perhaps more pointedly, inheritance as responsibility. For Derrida, being European means taking responsibility for the heritage of thought that reflects upon what Europe is and what it can become and what it must become. This is not a responsibility that is chosen by the sovereign subject either. It imposes itself upon us. For Derrida, being what we are is first of all this inheritance, and in fact, this inheritance is our task. Derrida ultimately thinks that we are, insofar as we inherit. Taking responsibility for this inheritance means keeping the openness of the concept of Europe through its relation to the other, non-Europe. The task consists in a double movement of being faithful to the concept of Europe. Being faithful does not mean being faithful to the concept of Europe as already established, but as that task. But being faithful nonetheless is being faithful to that task. And at the same time, remaining committed to its openness because it comes with the task. You inherit it. So it is double, and you do not have choice of either or. It comes with both, and it has to be tackled that way. Therefore, that task that comes as both, as not either or, requires recognizing that Europe is the name of an identity involving conflicting demands, that it produces a mode of being that is infinitely open to what is other than itself, and that always changes, and it is in the sense that Europe is a project is yet to come. I think that it is also in the sense that Europe is a question of non-Europeans. Twisting it around now, our responsibility, there can never be a question of Europe without the presence of non-Europe. We, the non-Europeans, are a question for Europe. Derrida, of Algerian French and Jewish upbringing, and other things that can be added that mosaic, and Said, of Arab Christian and Palestinian upbringing, other things can be added that complexity, seem to announce Europeans are already contaminated by non-Europeans. It is also in this significant sense that the question of Europe is not merely one question among others. It is a question that projects itself beyond its boundaries, beyond its limits, especially those of a geographical, political, and cultural nature. The question of Europe is always at once a chance and a danger. To capture this aspect of Europe as a concept, it's never adequate to recall the question as a question of crisis. So then it turns also a critical eye to itself, thinking of Europe as crisis. That's not enough, because to begin with crisis would suggest that Europe as a concept and idea was once stable, and that now it is destabilized, that this moment of destabilization is a temporary moment. But as a beginning point for reflecting in Europe, the trope of crisis is equivalent to the idea that Europe is identical with itself, and it cannot be accepted. Europe is crisis. Instability is its condition of possibility. accepting that as the beginning point of reflecting on Europe and the non-Europe is the responsibility that we inherit. The beginning point of reflecting on Europe, then, cannot be its ostensible unity or stability. We cannot enter into a debate of what is Europe, what is called Europe, without reference to what it constitutes as non-European. If the beginning point, its originary promise, then, is its openness, inescapable originary promise is its openness, the task that we inherit without choice, or rather its commitment to openness defining itself with other than what it is, placing itself always under this question, then the name of this task is at once Europe and non-Europe. The question is not about Europeans as such, but Europeans and non-Europeans, and Europeans as non-Europeans. Europe is that name which signifies the commitment to place itself under that question, qua what itself is not. That's why Europe cannot be seen as a geography, it cannot be seen as a polity, it cannot be seen as a political project, a culture, or even civilization, but stands for radical openness of that space which took as its name as the name of the other. That's also why we, the non-Europeans, are a historical problem of Europeans. Derrida, therefore, insists that it would be essential to study and take seriously into account, beginning with the Greece of Plato and Aristotle, of Hellenism and Neoplatonism, what gets passed on, transferred, translated from Europe, pre- and post-Quranic Arabic, as well as by Rome. In other words, this immense opening that comes with the recognition of the task is instantly to think about the tradition that we inherited and its impurities. What elements go into constitute that which we inherited as Europe? What are those elements that made up Europe and the sense of Europeanness? In that sense, Arabic as a language and culture, or even a task itself, cannot be seen as outside Europe. It is part of Europe, it is elementary construction. He says, we feel strongly the seriousness of the question whether philosophy was born in Greece or not. Seriousness of this question whether philosophy is born in Greece or not. This is as radical as it gets in terms of thinking the task that we inherited as Europe, as we know in political theory, is the habitual beginning point is the Greeks. The Greeks as the constitutive element of Europe, unquestionably, purely, and continuously. Whether it is European or not now becomes a question for us. But that question does not stop there. Whether one can speak of Chinese philosophy, whether one can speak of African philosophy, or whether the destination of philosophy is marked by a singular source, thus by a singular language, or a network of singular languages, become itself a question. That comes with that inheriting that task and responsibility. For Derrida, then, the fact that Europe's origin is not identical to itself should lead to understanding historically the multiple sources of its constitution. Derrida was convinced that it is wholly inappropriate to regard the identity of Europeans historically as solely Greek, with some additional Jewish, Christian, and Islamic supplements. Rather, Europeans are all these things, and these things are all open to them at once. How do we recognize that responsibility? Our current curriculum in the universities does not recognize that responsibility. Our current mainstream established way in which we have instituted knowledge does not recognize that responsibility. How do we recognize that responsibility and begin to recognize the multiple sources of identity of European philosophy and European thought? The openness that Said anticipates in his reflections on Freud and the way Derrida approaches Europe as an open project are radical in the sense that they place demands on us, Europeans and non-Europeans alike, to refigure our relationship with our multiple sources of identity and identifications. For Europeans, the urgency of this reconfiguration becomes immediately apparent as regards to the ancient Greeks. For major European philosophers, Europe always comes into existence with the ancient Greeks. This can be said also in terms of political theory. Our cardinal concepts, the concepts that we can't do without, concepts that constantly points of reference for us, concepts that order our understanding of the political, concepts that regulate the relationship between polity, culture, as well as ways of being political, such as citizenship. These are always traced unquestionably, continuously, and purely to the Greeks. Now, that becomes a question for us. The birth certificate of Europe as philosophy is staged as inescapably Greek, Derrida says. And Derrida complicates that this relationship, particularly the ancient Greek history. To emphasize, it's not that Derrida ever disowns that originary moment, or it's not that he ever constitutes the problem as one of dismissal or even overcoming of tradition. It remains open what it means to inherit that problem. It is not immediately populated, but it certainly goes against the grain of the temptation of dismissal, overcoming, moving beyond, shifting elsewhere, or decentering. No, the task remains to be populated. He complicates this relationship to Greece. What he does is that he multiplies the sources of Europe as philosophy. Derrida accepts that what we rigorously recognize as philosophy, as such, does not exist perhaps elsewhere as a project than Greece. Philosophy as thought of being and existence perhaps was born in Greece. To make this recognition requires neither Orientalism or Occidentalism, depending on the point of view of evaluation, nor historicism. But it means to recognize that it will have traces of non-Europeans within it. Now, a year after his Turin lecture, Derrida was invited in 1991 to respond to two contributions by Eric Alliez and Francis Wolff, who had discussed the relations of Derrida, Deleuze, and Foucault to ancient Greeks during a colloquium organized by Barbara Cassin. His oral response was subsequently published, Nous autres Grecs, and has been only recently translated into English as We, Other Greeks. As the translators note, the phrase Derrida uses in the original title can mean we who are Greek, but it can also mean we too are Greeks as an affirmation, or it can also mean we Greeks of another kind, as a claim of difference but also equivalence. As the editors note, this is perhaps the most extensive, if not the most explicit, of Derrida's reflections on his relationship to ancient Greeks. So I will dwell a few moments on this relationship. This piece clearly illustrates that the Greek question for Derrida was a significant and passionate issue. When addressing that question, he said, we are inevitably in the presence of, to quote, an intrusion of the other, of the wholly other, who forces the limits of identification and the relationship of language, the corpus, or the system to itself. It is thus a question of locating the traces of this intrusion, traumas, inclusion of the excluded, introjection, incorporation, mourning, and so on, rather than defining some essence or self-identity of the Greek, the originary truth of a language, corpus, or system with us. Derrida welcomes the efforts to see resonances and resemblances within contemporary thought to identify a configuration or a generation of approaches to the Greek question, But also in 1991, when he's given this oral presentation, he declares this is not enough. It's not enough to think of a number of Parisian intellectuals and their relationship to Greece and considering as though they are of an identical generation or an identical body of work. We and the Greeks as a question too fractured and impure to enable the shaping of a merely generation or a school. We have to also introduce inescapable barriers through which and in which I as Derrida, he seems to say, Foucault as Foucault, and Deleuze as Deleuze established their relationships to the Greeks. And by saying that, he also implies that he has his own Greeks, followed with a pun, which I don't think should be underestimated, says, to each according to his Greeks. Derrida, in my view, signals the impossibility of identifying a generation, a corpus, with all the resonances and analogies. Then he notes, for example, his very difficult relationship to the way Nietzsche or Heidegger relates to the Greek thing. He then wonders why in the 20th century many scholars have chosen Greek words to name historical formations, such as epoche, Heidegger or Husserl, paradigm by Kuhn, episteme, Foucault, themata, Holton, and it goes on. Why there is this temptation, why there is this insistence on something that is being inventively introduced to thought also is named with a Greek name. What are the consequences? What are the effects that this produces? He suggests, no less in a footnote, this usage indicates or evokes three powers and all at once, and each of which needs to be genealogically traced and investigated. What effects this habitual invocation produces? First one, he says, the invention of the new, namely a concept that is irreducible to those circulating in everyday language. It has that effect. So then what we do as thinkers, we then relate anything that is inventive with the expectation that it is going to come from at least a Greek dialect, some Greek translation. If it isn't Greek, it is not new, seems to be the effect that it puts into place. The second one, the supposed invention of the new as an archaeological discovery, restoration, reactivation, or liberation of an occluded or even a forbidden memory, tracing that in and finding in the originary moment with the Greeks. So when we name something episteme, we're also enacting that particular effect of that word. And then finally, the third power, the authority attached to the use of rare words or ancient languages considered to be learned languages. It's almost as if a philosopher who is worthy of the name cannot possibly but introduce a Greek word into the vocabulary, one way or another. That is also the other enactment, the performative force, if you like, of bringing a Greek word to describe something. Then he goes on to say, for his own Greeks, Derrida then resolutely and emphatically asserts, quote, it is not only the non-Greek that attracted me to the Greek, not only the other of the Greek, the Egyptian, the barbarian, or whoever is determined by the Greek as his other, and so is excluded, included, posed as opposable, but the wholly other of the Greek, of his language and his logos, this figure of a wholly other that is unfigurable by him. This wholly other haunts, Derrida says, every one of the essays I have devoted to Greek things, and it often erupts within them under different names, for it perhaps has no proper name. Derrida insists that we must really resist an either-or injunction where we as Europeans are obligated to announce ourselves as Greeks by an automatic inheritance or having broken with them by a law or liberation. Either choice is a false choice. It's an impossible choice for Derrida. If we are still or already Greeks, we ourselves, we others, we also inherit that which made them already other than themselves, and more or less than they themselves believed. And this is inescapable. He goes on, if the legacy of the thought of truth, of being in which we are inscribed is not only, not fundamentally, not originally Greek, it is no doubt because of other convergent and heterogeneous foliations, other languages, other identities that are not simply added on, again, like secondary attributes or supplements. The Jew, the Arab, the Christian, the Roman, the German, and so on. It is no doubt because European history has not simply unfolded what was handed down to it by the Greek. It is especially because the Greek himself never gathered himself or identified with himself in the first place. Approaching it from another angle, Said, in my view, articulates this openness differently. He says, quote, if you know in advance already that the African or Iranian or Chinese or Jewish or German experience is fundamentally integral, coherent, separate, and therefore comprehensible only to Africans, Iranians, Chinese, Jews, or Germans, you first of all, the first move, whether you like it or not, the first move you make is to posit as essential something which I believe, Said says, is both historically created and the result of interpretation, namely the existence of Africanness, Jewishness, Germanness, or for that matter, Orientalism and Occidentalism. But that's the first move. Moreover, when that move is made, it invites another, without choice, without intention, without any ill meaning or well meaning either. Moreover, he says, you are likely as a consequence of the first move to defend the essence or experience itself rather than promote full knowledge of it and its entanglements and dependencies on other languages, on other knowledges. As a result, you will demote the different experience of others to a lesser status. So the second move followed through the first, Said says, inevitably leads to establishing a hierarchy of superiority and inferiority, that which you considered as other, as inescapable conclusion of the either-or blackmail, if you like. I mentioned earlier that for both Derrida and Said, the fundamental crisis of Europe is the inability to approach the non-Europeans with the openness it demands. Now, calling attention to the fundamental crisis of Europe, that Europe is crisis, is no less than re-evaluating the multiple origins that constitute Europeans and their relationships to non-Europeans. It not only requires revisiting the Greek thing and the inheritance that it implies, but also re-evaluating a whole series of ostensible differences that have been put into play for centuries, especially though over the last few decades. It also requires exposing a whole series of differences that have been concealed within Europe itself as the questions of others within Europe. So then the infinite task of Europe is infinite, not because it is over the horizon beckoning us to orient ourselves toward it as a mystical, magical question. It is infinite because many contemporary problems are rooted in the fundamental crisis of Europe's inability to approach the non-European with the openness it demands. I have already mentioned the problem of others within Europe and the problems of non-Europeans as being distinct, but related problems of this fundamental crisis. The symptoms of these problems are all around us. The way in which European social and political thought, for example, always begins with its distinctiveness as the originary place of democracy, that it is the original place of equality, of all the impurity questions that I put before you with Derrida and Said, that its beginning points of original place of liberty, rights, and citizenship is just that, is a symptom of this fundamental crisis of Europe, of its inability to open itself to the other, or recognize the task that it implies. European thought has been unable to open itself up to the possibility that such fundamental institutions are not originary, but connected with non-European histories, or rather originate from dialogical relations between European and non-European histories. European social and political thought has not been able to approach non-European forms of thought with the openness they demand because it has created an insular aura about its origins and its distinctiveness. And even, and this is something that Said has taught us, superiority. The examples are many from its history, but the contemporary difficulty of creating at least a modicum of comparative political thought, for example, attests to its continuing hold on the life of the European mind. When this insularity and closeness persist in European and social political thought, it is not surprising to find xenophobia not as prejudice against non-Europeans, both within Europe and without, but as an endemic condition of relatedness. Today, differences amongst Europeans generate responses that are just as xenophobic and interlaced with resentment as responses to non-Europeans. From the acrimony surrounding the accession of Turkey into the European Union to utterly ignorant and disingenuous approaches to China and India, and from disparaging statements about Greek, Italian, Spanish, or Portuguese political cultures to the treatment of the Roma and Sinti peoples in Germany, France, and elsewhere, yet again, the contemporary symptoms of the fundamental crisis of Europe. This is not temporary. That Derrida and Said invite us to see are clearly visible. Now the question that I'm neither equipped nor able to respond adequately, but at least I can pose it as a question and we can have a discussion with the help of Etienne Balibar. How do we respond to this task? The task is before us. It's an immense task. I really like that word. It's immense. It's good to remind ourselves it is not an easy task. It is certainly not an overnight task. It is an ongoing task of inheriting that responsibility. How do we assume the responsibility for this task despite its immense challenge? Now, Etienne's idea of Europe as a vanishing mediator in his book, We, the People of Europe, with a question mark, is an opening point in responding to this question. But as I go along, I'm going to also remake this question that Etienne poses, and I will retranslate it into a demand of we, the non-Europeans, assuming that we, the people of Europe, or we, the Europeans, cannot be posed in the absence of we, the non-Europeans. And what does it mean to pose it together? Balibar proposes the idea of Europe as a vanishing mediator, to mean a figure that enables an imaginary of the new during the process of transformation of a society as the old gradually fades away. It's an imaginary of the moment between no longer and not yet. Balibar thinks this idea of the vanishing mediator is not much different from the process of translation of ideas from one idiom to another, and this is what my interest is. For Europeans, Balibar now speaks as belonging to we, the people of Europe. This might well constitute the exceptional character of Europe as translator or mediator of cultures. He admits that Europe is not the only space in the world to translate cultures from one language to another, but argues that, quote, nowhere, not even in India or in China, was it necessary to organize to the same degree the political and pedagogical conditions of linguistic exchanges. Now, we can have a discussion about whether finding an exceptional character for Europe is necessary, but what Balibar indicates to me here is the practice of translation is European and cannot be any other than European, but it cannot be enclosed within the borders of Europe. The very activity of translation that is taking place in Europe cannot be maintained within the borders of Europe. It resonates with the idea of Europe as a concept that I mentioned earlier. Balibar expands this task of Europe as vanishing mediator in two ways. First, it can be, he says, broadened to include Arabic, Turkic, Urdu, and other languages that are already spoken within Europe. That, again, this notion of impurity. Non-Europeans are not those who are outside Europe, but it's already spoken, it's present within Europe. It can also be expanded, though, by stretching the idea of translation from even language to culture. For this utopia, or myth, for Balibar admits that its enigmatic character and its impossibilities, but also the necessity of declaring it, Europe can become an interpreter of the world, translating cultures and languages in all directions. Now, both Derrida and Said were attentive to the questions of linguistic and cultural translation and offered significant insights on relays of translation between the European and the non-European. That each perform these insights as non-Europeans make them especially European in the sense I have indicated in this lecture. Derrida, is significant to underline, called himself an over-colonized European hybrid. And Said described his life as always out of place, with dissonances. Throughout this lecture, you will have noticed I alternated between their voices as Europeans and non-Europeans. Sometimes I made them speak as Europeans, and sometimes I made them speak as non-Europeans. That is not a contradiction. It is part of that space of openness that I'm talking about. Now, Balibar calls this multi-directional linguistic and cultural translation a utopia or a myth to indicate perhaps the impossibility of the task, but it also places urgent and immediate demands on both Europeans and non-Europeans. For those intellectuals practicing in social science and humanities, especially for us, the demand is no less than to reevaluate many of the central concepts with which we perform ourselves as Europeans and others as non-Europeans: democracy, rights, autonomy, determination, citizenship, law, territory, and state. Tracing the impure histories of these concepts, the ways in which they traverse different cultures and spaces, and the ways in which each rationalized and justified pure origins while masking other differences is now our responsibility. Thank you very much.
I was wondering if you could say a little bit about the sort of complicity of the figure of the woman with that of the occluded non-European. This is something that worried Freud and Derrida. I mentioned the beast and the sovereign yesterday, and Derrida says that the beast is actually the woman. And so, it worried him in economimesis, in white mythology, that, the metaphorization of Europe itself stems from the subjugation of the figure of the woman. And the reason I ask you this is because, of course, haunting our discussions about the identity of Europe is, of course, the failed Eurozone. And I was reminded, of course, also of the misogyny surrounding the death of Margaret Thatcher. I'm not a fan of Thatcher, I hasten to add. But coming not from Europe, but from a country which has genocidal leaders, I wondered last week whether an old woman dying of Alzheimer's deserved the sort of obscenity of celebrations that surrounded her death. And also wondering about, the sort of phallicization and demonization of Mrs. Merkel. And I'm wondering if this is not something that we need to pay as much attention to as the racial other of Europe.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question is here and then here. Yes.
Ms. Isin, thank you for your lecture. My name is Ernst van den Hemel. I'm a research fellow at the Center for the Humanities, and I'm working on the rise of conservative nationalism in Western Europe. And my question relates to that because I was just wondering, even though I share the program of thinking about Europe in crisis as you outlined it based on the work of Derrida and Said, perhaps the audience now and the historical specificity of this crisis is different. with respect to when Derrida responded to the Greek notion of Europe in 1991. And allow me to give you a couple of examples. Many of the aspects of Europe that you mention, its nature to always be connected to the other, its openness to others, its perpetual crisis, these are all arguments that are, electorally speaking, successfully incorporated by conservative nationalist political parties in Germany, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in England. And I was wondering whether this rise of nationalism that takes the pluriformity of Europe for granted might not call for an affirmation of the Derridian and Saïdian project that you outlined, that is slightly different than in the 90s. In my opinion, the language about Europe is less unifying now, and it's more exploding. So perhaps we are in need of a language that is less critical of the unifying language of the European Union and that knows how to incorporate and affirm pluriformity in times of rising conservative nationalism. Okay. So I was wondering what your thoughts on that were.
Thank you very much. And now our final question here. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. I have enjoyed your talk, and as I also enjoyed all the other talks that were undertaken in this. I have enjoyed your talk, as I have also enjoyed all the other talks that were given in this symposium. I want to make a comment, not necessarily a question, which is that it's an immense task. I agree with you. But I have some concern about who actually should be doing the revising. It seems that the debate is still among Europeans. And the voice of the other is still quasi-sealed off. So even Said himself, with all due respect, maybe call it a forcefully Europeanized intellectual. And he himself actually said that his demeanor, his disposition, his mental are actually of the West, although he is a native of the East. So in my humble opinion, it's time to expand the boundaries of the critical, the boundaries of the analytical, the boundaries of the historical, the boundaries of the cultural, all of this, and therefore invite others to actually participate, at least in the revisionists, with the fact that they were never a part of the grand design of what we are talking about. Thank you.
Thank you. So if I could ask you, Engin, to respond to these three questions.
Thank you. I'll start with the last one on the question of expanding the boundaries of Europe in terms of understanding the project and, as you called it, inviting others to participate in the project. I really do think that the task as described, as articulated by Derrida and Balibar is that task. The task itself cannot be maintained within the boundaries of Europe. But what does it mean to open the boundaries of that Europe in which we can have the participation of all the elements that make up, all the elements that go into making up the European is an open question. And we have hardly begun that task. Again, I come back to university curriculums and how they are organized, how we organize university disciplinary structures, how we organize university institutional structures, and how, for example, Europe always begins with itself. Even to introduce a change in that enormous machinery that we call the curriculum has just barely begun, allowing others to participate in making up that project. So itself is really, we are in the very beginnings of articulating a project with all the uncertainties that is implied by the term beginning, all the fragility, all the uncertainties, all the difficulties of gaining attraction, gaining an effective foothold on how knowledge is produced, how knowledge is disseminated, how knowledge can be equipped to face the question of its own impurities, the elements that make up into constituting the very notion of knowledge. In this way, although we may look upon the last 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, however you want to cut it, favorably, but on the other hand, it is also significant to look at it as with doubt, with all the uncertainty that implies that term, the beginning. It is a much longer project in a way than actually we realize. On the question of conservative nationalism, the question of openness to the other and so on, whether that can be and is not assimilated into conservative nationalism, and not only that, but also translated into electoral success. Also the question of whether Europe defines itself today as a unified space against the other. It already constitutes itself as incorporating others. I would be careful about distinguishing two vocabularies, two idioms, and two ways of relating to the question of dialogic or the question of otherness. Although, of course, there is an official discourse, whether you want to call European multiculturalism or European diversity, that seems to indicate that, in fact, Europe is being rethought as a possibility toward openness. As many scholars have shown, underneath that, what you're calling conservative nationalism is just what that term implies, conservatism. Conservatism in the sense that it is not actually re-articulating the terms of Europe, but in fact allowing those who are constituted as others to enter into the space of Europe, or in the case of member states, terms dictated by already what it means to be European, or what it means to be French, what it means to be Swiss, what it means to be German, and so on. So these terms are already fixed. These terms themselves are not open to negotiation. These terms are already determined. But within these terms, how do we negotiate the difference, the peaceful existence, multiculture, you name it? But many scholars have indicated the problematic nature of that governmental incorporation of diversity as discourse. Whereas here, the openness, the radicalness of the openness that I'm laying out with Said and Derrida is that a radical openness where the very terms of what it means to be European, and by extension, of course, very terms of what it means to be French, what it means to be German, are put on the table as terms of negotiation, as impure terms, with a double move. First, the recognition that, in fact, it did not come into being on its own in the first place. And second, having recognized that it did not come into being by itself, what does it mean to rewrite the history of how it came into being by incorporating other elements? And that leads me to the question of the woman. Now, when we look at the European, non-European, of course, the discourse is also divided between men and women. But not only that either, as we have seen, it's heteronormativity, as well as sexual normativity of the European philosophical languages are well established, and I'm really not the one who should be reminding ourselves of that. And in there are very strong elements of that. He does point to the absence of the figure of woman in articulating the European. There is the absence of the question of gender in articulating the core space of the European. But I did not mean, and I don't think either Said or Derrida mean, by using the term non-European as an open space, that it is ethno-racial, or even linguistic, or even cultural. There is no already defined strategy to determine the space of the non-European and identify that as being civilizational, cultural, sexual, gender-based, perhaps all of the above and more, that space of the non-European. And thank you for reminding me to make that significant reminder as well, significant point, that it is not just ethno-racialized other that is at question here, although it keeps coding and recoding itself in different ways that appear to be is about linguistic and other cultural elements.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thank you.